Alright guys, this is going to be a redo of a video or two videos that I've done on this particular subject because potentially something that the way that I approached it or by me going through the subject matter too fast that people were not quite getting where I'm coming from or what I'm even trying to say, and I got a lot of accusations and sometimes threats because of the thing that they thought I was saying and that I was advocating for risky, potentially deadly behavior, and I'm not. And so let me go ahead and jump into what you might be tempted to say in the comments or emails or in the group or in the chat, which is that, just don't do it. You're going to die. People are going to die because they're engaging in choking and stuff like that. Never let anybody choke you, never choke anybody. Have I covered basically all of it? And also, just saying that you're a doctor is not going to convince anybody. So if you really are a doctor and you want to have a sit down with me and have like a conversation, I will vet you first to make sure that I can confirm that you are who you say you are, and I will give you as much voice as you want to. But the first point that I would like to make here is that when we are looking at the ways that we can convince people to not engage in a particular behavior, the approach of just say no to drugs did not work. Say no to smoking didn't work. When we teach abstinence-only education for sex ed, what it does is it leads children to be unprepared for sex when they are ready to be. It's not acknowledging the fact that 90 to 95% of the US population has premarital sex, and so people are still not practicing abstinence-only sex education. It means that they are not educated on contraception. It means that they do not know how to handle or protect themselves from sexually transmitted infections. It leads to a lack of emotional awareness of how sex might, change us in the way that we think about our relationships, right? Where some people go into having sex and thinking that it means that somebody likes them, or mismanages expectations, and really by focusing on abstinence-only education in that regard just really does a shit ton of harm, and there's no data to show that it actually prevents children from having premarital sex or having sex even before they graduate high school. So what the data does show when it comes to like drug interventions, smoking interventions, drinking, and all that is that when the child sits down with a trusted adult, like whether it is a teacher that they happen to like, or they have recurrent dinner conversations where there is trust and there is care, and they are in environments where they can have open discussions and where they can ask questions, those are the children that tend to grow up being more informed and being able to make more responsible decisions. So when you jump into the comments or you post or you do anything that says, just don't get involved in choking, first of all, what you are communicating is that you are not a safe person to talk to about this, that you are not going to look at nuance, that you are not somebody that somebody can come to if they're struggling with it. And one of the points that I'm going to be making here later on is that when people do engage in erotic asphyxiation, there is a tendency where people need it more, it becomes addictive, and people get to the point where they cannot ejaculate without being choked. And also perpetuating these social stigmas against choking, what that tends to do is it means that sometimes they can't be open with their partners about the fact that they are interested in that, and it means that when they engage in any type of erotic asphyxia, they're doing it by themselves and thinking that they are creating these safety measures that can prevent them from having from dying from it. And even if, let's say that you were doing it in a method where you had this surefire way that the moment that you passed out, the pressure would come off, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to survive the encounter. One of the things that choking can do is it can actually, because the brain is signaling to the heart that it's not getting oxygen, is it tells the heart to work harder. When the heart works harder, it can go into what's called arterial fibrillation, which is cardiac arrest. So even if you release that pressure, you could go into cardiac arrest, and since there's nobody around, nobody knows that you're in cardiac arrest, and so there's not going to be an intervention that's going to lead to rescue. And the other thing is that when we perpetuate these social stigmas, it also means that people can't turn to people that they trust, who really need to know that these behaviors are going on, such as a mental health provider. If it's a psychologist, if you're dealing with it and it's become an addiction where you really need help, may not feel comfortable bringing that up in that situation. There are also psychological conditions that could be caused by this behavior that your psychiatrist might need to know about, because they might be trying to medicate for a condition that is caused by brain damage that has come from erotic asphyxia. So by shutting down the conversation, by not allowing people to go into the nuances and the dangers, you're preventing people from getting help. The other thing is that there is, especially when some type of torque or twist has happened along with pressure on the carotid arteries, this can actually strain and stretch the arteries, which can create more propensity for plaque buildup, clogging of that area that can lead to eventually to a stroke. It can also rupture, leading to bleeding and death of the brain. So, again, by not talking to your doctor about the fact that you may have engaged in erotic asphyxia because of the social stigmas that are around it, that you people in the comment section keep perpetuating, they're not getting screened for that. And there are screens that can be done, especially when somebody is a domestic abuse survivor, and they go in and they see their doctor, and the doctor's like, oh, your partner strangled you. We need to check to make sure that check the integrity of those arteries to make sure that, 1 month to 3 months after the incident, that doesn't rupture and cause a fatal problem, right? And so really, I think that when we're looking at who's being more irresponsible here, I think that the people who are shutting down or trying to shut down conversations around safety are doing a lot more harm than people who are genuinely trying to inform people. So please, listen to what I'm saying, listen to the way that I am explaining things, and try to understand that treating people with respect and empathy basically allows the conversation to continue. It tells them that they can come to me if they have questions, or if they have concerns, or if they're worried about something. And likewise, I am kind of putting nuance into the very loud voices that are out there that are actually perpetuating the idea that the behavior may be safer than it actually is, because they're being disingenuous about the conditions that they are in that have led to the conclusion that it's safer than it is. So I'm not being permissive by having this conversation. I'm not trying to give people a pass to say go ahead and do it, or even saying that there is a safe way of doing it, even though there are going to be parts of this discussion where I do imply that certain behaviors are more dangerous than others. That does not mean that the behaviors that are not in this red category are without danger. So please be respectful. If I miss a detail, you can put it down in the comments and be respectful. If you don't want it to be public, send it in an email. Back up your concerns with some type of evidence of how you came to that conclusion. I will give it consideration, and if I need to do a follow-up, I will, because I am more concerned about putting out good quality information that makes people more informed than I am about just running my mouth or giving people an excuse to engage in something that may or may not be safe. So please be mindful that I'm not necessarily not on your side. And when I make this statement that I have been choked, I have choked people out, that it is a thing that I have been around for a very long time. I've been in the kink community, I've been in the wrestling community for 20 years. And so I do, and I've read pretty much every article out there that talks about this, and I do see a glaring problem with the influences that are leading people to conclude whether or not this is a safe behavior. Oftentimes, the articles that you find that are within the kink community are leaning a little bit too much in the permissive side, where they're not going into enough detail and they're not giving information that helps people recognize that there are problems that could potentially be related to erotic asphyxia. And that might be something that if somebody recognizes that, they might stop and say, oh, shit, that sounds like me. Maybe I need to alter my behavior, right? And there are also studies out there, the very few studies that really, really look at the long-term damage of being choked. Mostly are looking at the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu community, and they are unfortunately very anecdotal. The sample size is ridiculously small, and the way that they vetted the people that participated in the studies is really, really highly suspect, that it makes me really feel like the people who designed that study, which by the way, there's no meta-analysis, there's nothing that's going over those studies that is looking at them in a critical way that says, oh shit, this is true or this is absolutely bullshit. And the problem with that is that the result of that, because when a new study comes out that says something that is unexpected, the media gets a hold of it and they broadcast it like crazy. They overemphasize the conclusions of that study and make it sound like the scientific community or the medical community don't know what the fuck they're talking about. And it can give people the wrong perceptions. We see this all the time when it comes to nutrition. We see it all the time when it comes to vaccines. And so I'm going to go ahead and dive into that a little bit later on. So I'm sorry this is going to be a long one, which is why I have water, and you're going to see me drink a lot because it's going to dry the hell out of my throat. So let's look at the influences that people have as far as what is like actually creating the fantasies for people getting choked out. First of all, you have organizations like the WWE, BG East, PWP, and various other wrestling companies that do staged chokeouts. They're completely fake. And when people get choked out, oftentimes the person choking them out may hold the choke way after it's very clear that the other person is unconscious. The person stays unconscious and nobody becomes concerned. Sometimes this can last minutes or so, and that is very much so misrepresenting what actually happens when somebody gets choked out. When somebody gets choked out, it usually takes about 4 to 10 seconds if a choke is applied properly, that they will fade pretty quickly. There will usually be some level of convulsions, and it's not always clear because sometimes people expect like the eyes to close or something like that. Sometimes when people pass out, their eyes stay open, and they just kind of become vacant and non-responsive. They might twitch and shake for a while, and usually between 4 to 20 seconds, they start to come back and they wake up. And for the first or couple times that happens, you might freak out and be like, oh shit, what is going on? How do I handle the situation? Because it's not the peaceful passing out that you see in pro wrestling. And then the other influence that we tend to have a lot of is going to be videos that people are posting to watch fighters. And I'm not trying to kink shame people here or say that they're wrong for enjoying themselves here and doing what they're doing. But what I will say is that a lot of the videos that are out there, again, are pushing that deep knockout fantasy, right? Where they're like, oh, well, we keep doing these chokeouts, but then the person who passed out isn't always aware that they passed out. They're just sometimes a little disoriented. Sometimes they forget how they get there. And it really doesn't matter how long somebody actually ends up passing out for. There usually isn't much in the way of an awareness for that person how long they were out for because their brain was turned off. Things didn't happen. So there isn't like, some different change in experience when somebody is choked out for a longer period of time. And so, but that's one of the problems is that because people are expecting something, right? They're looking for something that they think happens when you are very much so beyond a reasonable doubt, definitely knocked out, that just doesn't exist. It's not there. What happens is you just lose a little bit of time. And I saw one person in one of the comments mention that they had some dreams or something like that. I think that's fairly rare that that happens. And is it really benefiting you in any way, shape, or form? Is it increasing your sexual experience or whatever you're doing when that you're chasing when you do chokeouts, right? That when you do these longer chokeouts, what you're doing is you're depriving the brain of oxygen for longer periods of time that increases the risk of cardiac arrhythmia, right? Something that is going to lead to an emergency situation. You're going to increase the cranial blood pressure that can lead to petechias, ocular damage. Some people have had like a cloudy vision that goes over, like they have cataracts or something like that, to full ocular ruptures. So there could be significant eye damage that could lead to permanent blindness. And that's just kind of scratching the surface. The petechia, by the way, is just a popping of the capillaries that can make you look freckled, particularly around the eyes, because when you choke somebody out, the cranial pressure does tend to increase. And some people have this idea that if you take your time choking somebody out, that you go slower, that somehow this is going to decrease the amount of damage that is done. This is generally false because when you try to go for a slower chokeout, what ends up happening is that you are blocking the venous return of blood out of the head while still allowing arterial blood to go in. So the dangers of an aneurysm or potentially a stroke or some type of capillary damage, rupture, brain bleeds, and things like that, actually goes up because you're doing a slow chokeout that's just kind of giving people the sensation of being choked without necessarily going for the knockout. And so, that is also time that the brain is being deprived of oxygen to a certain level. And so, how much deprivation does it take to actually cause, brain damage? Well, there was a recent study that came out a couple of years ago that suggested that just wearing a necktie, which doesn't, you may not actually feel like your blood flows to your brain is actually being restricted all that much, but tight collars and neckties have been shown to cause brain damage over time. One of the things, and I want to kind of note this when it comes to brain damage that can come from chokes, is that, the amount of brain cell death that happens is pretty small, right? And I'm not trying to minimize risk here by saying that, but, people are kind of creating this narrative where people, when they get choked out, that they should be expecting a noticeable amount of cognitive change from just one chokeout. And then when people don't experience that, the belief that the amount of brain death that has occurred may not be significant at all. But because the brain does not have a tendency to heal itself, that does not tend to repair itself particularly well, those cells don't come back, every time that you do a chokeout, the amount of brain damage increases, right? Total. And so if this is a repeat behavior, and pretty much I don't think anybody ever starts getting choked and just does it once, and I was like, okay, I'm good. I'm going to stop going, right? This is usually something that once you start, you have a tendency to continue going. And again, addiction is one of those issues that can actually come from it. Some people have actually reported that they feel that erotic asphyxia is more addictive than cocaine. So that is, an honest risk. And I'm not trying to kink shame anybody here in any way, shape, or form. This is just, what we know so far about it. Now, again, the risks of choking, again, we have the damage that can happen to the artery, that can show up, immediately. You can actually rupture it immediately, and that can be a ER visit or death, or it can happen weeks, months away from the initial choke time. So you may have only done it once, caused the damage, and the death can actually occur down the road. So again, that is one of those things that we need to be acknowledging. Other issues as far as like the immediate death goes, we talked about the risk of cardiac arrest, we talked about stroke, we talked about yeah, just the numerous ways that things can generally go wrong. There are structures within the neck that are also of heavy concern. So again, we're talking about blood chokes, not necessarily putting a plastic bag over your head and going through hypoxia that way. And there are risks to that as well, especially there's not going to be the same risk of maybe blood clotting or something like that that's going to cause a stroke or an aneurysm or anything like that. So we're not dealing with the risk of blood pressure going up. But the thing about like just general hypoxia goes is that we are deoxygenating all the blood within the body, and it's not going to be an immediate thing for blood oxygen levels to return to normal. So if you were to say push that to the point of hypoxia, first of all, again, you are going to trigger potentially cardiac and or respiratory arrest that can be life-threatening. But on top of that, because the blood oxygen saturation is going to go down so much, the risk of damage and death goes beyond the time in which you actually start returning oxygen to the body. This is going to be the same for any type of chemical-based hypoxia, where the use of poppers, particularly things like maximum impact, where you have the aerosolized ones, ethers, chloroform, things like that. And also these chemicals oftentimes can also act as a respiratory suppressant. So not only are you desaturating the amount of oxygen that's in the blood, you can also trigger the person just stop breathing altogether. And that, of course, can also lead to death. So, the thing is that when you look online and you are looking for, well, okay, we've talked about the immediate risk, but how common is it really? Well, there isn't really any data that I could find that went on to talk about partnered erotic asphyxia. There doesn't seem to be much in the way of statistics about that. Everything seems to be pointing mostly towards autoerotic asphyxia. And while some resources say it's between 250 deaths per year up to 1,000, others have said that it's much lower than anticipated, around 160 deaths per year. And so it may make it seem like, well, okay, maybe it's not that common of a problem, maybe we don't need to address it. And maybe it has to do with more people choosing to do erotic asphyxia with a partner, which certainly does reduce the risk, right? So let's go ahead and talk about the responsibilities a little bit of that partner when that does happen. So first of all, you need to understand that if you choke somebody and there is an emergency, yes, you can end up going to jail. Right? This would be basically considered manslaughter if the person were to die. And so, you're not just consenting to the idea that that the other person's taking all the risks because they're the ones that are going to die. Your life can absolutely be destroyed for participating, right? And there's not going to be, much empathy that you're going to find in the legal system that says, well, this was consensual, therefore, we can let you off the hook or, give you a shortened sentence. That's not the way that the legal system is likely to respond to the fact that there was an incident. And secondly, first of all, I don't think that you should be engaging in this type of play at all if you do not have CPR certification. In fact, I don't really understand why people don't know how to do CPR. And I'm also going to criticize the Red Cross and the American Heart Association for kind of withholding some very important information about CPR that people absolutely need to understand. First of all, is that the rate of success with CPR, especially people who absolutely need CPR, actually surviving in the long run, is much lower than people would like you to believe, and that's because they want you to do it, right? Because it does buy time for that person so that medical professionals can get onto the site and actually address the problem. But if somebody is having a stroke, or they are having a blockage to their heart, or an embolism in their lung, when you're doing CPR, you may not actually get them to revive, for one thing. And once they revive, they may not be out of the blue. They actually have to go to the hospital and they have to remove that blockage. So it's not just the time that you're doing the CPR that determines whether or not they're going to survive, but it's the interventions that come after that. So it's really, really important that if you have a situation where somebody does become non-responsive, they don't wake up and they're not breathing, and you need to start performing CPR, the first thing that you need to do is you need to call 911. Sometimes the Red Cross and the American Heart Association will tell you to do one set of chest compressions, which is going to be 30 chest compressions at 100 beats per minute, 1 to 2 inches deep, right in the very center of their chest. And if you have a metronome app, or you want to play Staying Alive while you're doing it, great. But I probably wouldn't, bother trying to open up things, try to Google, YouTube, where's the Staying Alive, whatever. But knowing kind of what that tempo is and actually practicing it is very, very critical, and might be the thing that actually makes a difference whether or not the person survives. But the other thing that they don't generally tend to tell you is that when you do CPR, the person's ribs are likely to fracture. There's likely going to be a startling crack that, and this is why this annoys me so much that they don't tell you this, is that by not telling you this, you are in a stressful situation, and then you are surprised by the fact that the ribs have popped or cracked or broken or whatever, and then you have all these questions that pop into your head, which are, oh my God, I just injured them. Should I stop? No, you shouldn't stop. The reason why you shouldn't stop, just because you broke the ribs, is that if you do stop, they die, right? The broken rib is not going to determine whether or not they live or die. You don't have to worry about internal bleeding because the heart is not pumping. It's not moving blood around, so there's no pressure being created that is going to cause internal bleeding, right? So continuing CPR is really the only way that you're going to actually be able to give them a chance of actually surviving. And if you're not CPR certified and you don't renew every 2 years like you're supposed to, then you are really putting everyone you know at risk around you, because you do not know how to handle the situation if it goes bad, whether or not, you're just sitting in a restaurant. And so be aware that when you do CPR, you're going to have surprises. Those surprises, again, ribs breaking, person vomiting. That's going to be a fairly common one, especially if you're doing rescue breaths and you're not actually effectively directing air into their lungs, which is one of the reasons why there's been less emphasis in recent years on doing rescue breaths as part of CPR. And also people are afraid of germs, especially with COVID and all that. So, but just doing chest compressions by themselves actually does a lot of good at ensuring that that person will actually be able to make it in the long run. It gives them a much better chance than avoiding CPR because you don't want to do mouth to mouth, or you don't know how to do mouth to mouth effectively. So, we'll go ahead. Sorry, again, this is a lot of talking. So one of the complaints about the videos that I did before came from a supposed medical provider who said, just Google the risks. Just Google the data. There's plenty of good data on the internet, which, first of all, is incredibly tone deaf, reckless, and stupid. And the reason why I say that, and I know that this is the moment that, because I've gotten a lot of heat from making that particular statement, and let me go ahead and set the record straight here, okay? We have a major problem in the US right now where we have a bunch of preventable diseases that are making resurgence, particularly among children right now, because there was a shit fuck ton of misinformation on the internet about vaccines. Now, I will give Google some credit here and say that when you Google and try to find any anti-vax material on the internet right now, when you do a Google search, Google will not pull up anything that supports the idea that vaccines are unsafe. There is an overwhelming amount of data that comes up immediately that says that any anti-vax stuff is not scientifically sound, and it gives all the reasons why we know that all those concerns are being overblown and shouldn't really be considered, right? And so Google actually stepped up on that. But this is one of those esoteric topics that, again, people don't want to talk about because like what I faced by just having this conversation, by just talking about risk in a way that is non-judgmental and is just objective, that I have received an undue amount of backlash because of that. So it's one of those things that is not likely to be on Google's radar, where they are in any way, shape, or form auditing the risks that you might find. So what happens when you look at risks about choking? Well, first of all, the majority of the stuff that you're going to find that's not coming out of the kink community is going to be very objective. It's going to be sensationalist, trying to scare people away from it. That is coming from a position that people are not likely to be receptive to. The stuff that is coming out of the kink community tends to be less objective than it really should be, and it has a tendency to be a little bit more permissive than the information that I'm sharing to you now. I forgot to mention, by the way, I'm going to go back to injuries regarding choking, because that's actually really important, that you can damage these structures here, your cartilage structures. You can also damage your thyroid, and that can lead to some very major health complications down the road. Going back a little bit, and so that's like looking at the immediate dangers, which is what most of the data that we have is really, really focused on. And what was really problematic about that person's comment that said Google it was that he was making the claim that choking over time will lead to dementia. And so, I wanted to know, where is he coming from for that? And so, okay, why might a medical professional lead to that particular conclusion? Well, they're probably looking at hypoxic brain injuries, and when I'm saying hypoxic brain injuries, I'm talking about stroke, aneurysms, heart attacks, cardiac arrest, and drowning. Right? Which, when we look at those specific instances, the amount of time that the brain is without oxygen is actually rather significant, because there has to be the initial rescue, there has to be the call to 911, there is the ambulance transit time to the incident, there is the time in which that ambulance sometimes goes to the hospital, and maybe they're doing things that are mitigating the amount of damage that happens, but then there's the interventions that happen in the hospital. And so the amount of time that can possibly pass when it comes to those injuries is actually a lot of time for brain damage to actually occur. Generally, and there's also a lot of misinformation or information that's out there that seems like it's conflicting in regards to how quickly hypoxic brain damage happens to the brain, with a lot of people saying that happens in about 3 seconds of hypoxia or restricted blood flow to the brain, with other people saying it's 3 minutes. So, who are you going to believe when you're doing that type of research? And part of that is that the sources that are saying that are usually highly anecdotal. So people might not be swayed by, because they don't see erotic asphyxia as being equal to these traumatic brain injuries that are coming from these severe situations. And so they might not be as receptive to the idea that, these things leading to an increased occurrence of dementia being necessarily applicable to their situation. Now, again, I'm going to echo that when people engage in erotic asphyxia, that it tends to be repetitive over time, that people keep doing it, oftentimes chasing a deeper level of being knocked out, or that they repeat the incidences over and over again. And also, because people have a tendency to become more relaxed and accustomed to being choked out, oftentimes the fear or panic that comes from it is what excites them into being able to reach climax or whatever it is that they're looking for when they're getting choked out. So, because of the nature of the familiarity with the sensation, that panic level goes down, but the desire to continue to chase that panic tends to maintain. So it's just like if you take opioids or any other drug where you are chasing a high that your brain just becomes less and less susceptible to, and eventually that leads to overdose without you ever being able to find that high again. So the risk of even beginning on a erotic asphyxia journey is that over time you're going to be chasing more and more of that initial sensation that may be harder and harder to come by. So there is a risk of that. And the longer that you do it for, there is going to be more risk of having an incident, especially as it creates more arrhythmias in your heart over time, makes it more susceptible to cardiac arrest and things like that. And there could be more damage that's happening to your arterial structure. So the risk goes up the more you do it, the longer you do it, and the more brain damage happens over that time that can actually make your brain into a similar injured position as some of these more, these greater, more life-threatening incidences would. So it's going to be a very, very similar effect over time, right? That's the point there. So there is reason to believe that what people are saying based on these types of injuries might actually become very real concerns for somebody who engages in erotic asphyxia over time. However, people might start to equate themselves with the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Judo communities and trying to say, okay, well, this is where the best source of data is going to come from, because the people who are practicing these sports have a tendency to be choked over and over again. Sometimes they get choked out. Most practitioners do get choked out at one point in time or another, whether in competition or in practice. So there is generally an idea that these people will be more informed about what the reality of being choked is. However, the position that people who are practicing these martial arts are coming from is actually a little bit disingenuous. And the reason why I say that is because when people are practicing chokes in a martial arts setting, we oftentimes will put them on for like maybe 2 to 3 reps, where the person, when they start to feel that congestion in their face, they can feel that their blood flow is starting to get restricted, they will tap, and that will be it. And then, over a period of time while they're drilling, they will be less and less pressure will be put on, and so they're not going to a level where there is going to be much damage or much risk being applied to the person, because they're actually going relatively gentle over time. That same is going to be relatively true for when they are sparring, especially in a class setting where a choke is implied. They go for the tap, and then people tap because they realize they're trying to roll to learn. They're not trying to roll like they're competing. And so the amount of time that they might fight it, because they're not motivated to fight it more like they would be in a tournament, they're going to tap out a lot faster. So the idea that their experience is going to be necessarily applicable to an erotic asphyxia kind of experience is a little bit misleading, because the length of time that the choke is going to be put on, the objective of the choke, is not going to actually translate particularly well. And when you look at a lot of BJJ forums, when you look at articles that are in BJJ related publications, is that, is overwhelmingly that chokes are considered generally safe. And a lot of that really has to do with the circumstances in which the chokes are being applied. So is that going to be generally applicable to the situation of the demographic that we are actually talking about? Probably not. In fact, there isn't a whole lot of data that actually talks directly about this particular subset of people. So there are 2 studies that were actually looking at BJJ practitioners, and they both studies I think are garbage studies, personally. So the first one had 11 participants on one side, 11 on the control group side, and they did some brain imaging, and they did some cognitive tests and whatnot, but there wasn't really much selectivity to who they picked as far as their sample group goes. So, they're in their early 30s, generally speaking, and they were not necessarily people that had necessarily participated for a particularly long period of time, so they were not going to be subjected to a level of insult to the brain that might show up on any type of imaging or cognitive change test that would be of any value, right? So that test, the problem with that that study specifically is that it was published. It was published in several articles, which, by the way, when you do your Google searches, it's likely going to be one of the first things that pops up. And the headlines that you see in these new articles are along the lines of the risk of blood chokes in BJJ are significantly lower than previously assumed, right? Which is a very conclusive way of saying that you have no reason to be concerned, and that is an incredibly dangerous conclusion to come to, especially when you have a sample size of subjects who are actually being tested to see if there's any change or any damage done. That 11 people is just a laughably small sample size. That's just bad science, and the conclusions that they came to, they actually stated in the study that the practicing of blood chokes and whatnot seems to actually increase blood flow to the brain, which again, the thing is that they didn't, look at these people at the start of their BJJ journey where they had never been choked ever, and then decided to check in on them when they're at a blue or purple belt, which would imply at least 2 to 6, maybe even 8 years of practicing to see if there were cognitive changes or changes to the data. So there's no start point to validate the results that they got. And there's no measurement of change that was done in that particular study. So their conclusions are unfortunately bullshit and not really supported by the data that they collected because of the way that they went about their data. The second study that has I found is looking at people that they found on Reddit, and it was just done via questionnaire, which again is not a great way of trying to determine what long-term effects one can actually expect from participating in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and being subjected to chokes. So again, their data, there's some selection bias that's coming from that data. There is bias in the fact that these are Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners who are not necessarily being critical of how they're forming their opinions, believing that they're going under more choking than they actually are, and therefore coming to the conclusion that what they're doing is not affecting their mental health, is not affecting the brains in any detrimental way, and the data kind of goes along with that. So it's not really great data to be looking at. So again, when you're looking at BJJ and judo practitioners, you're really looking at people who are giving anecdotal biased information, and the two studies kind of seemed like they were designed in a way in order to confirm those biases rather than actually find scientific truth. Now, there was a study that comes out of, I think it was Indiana, that was looking at girls who were going to the college that the study was performed at, and they had, I think, like 40 girls in both groups. It might have been like 20, 25 in each group. So the control group, which were ones that had never been choked during sex, versus the ones that had been choked at least 4 times in the last month and had reported significant choking during sex in the years leading up to the study. And the thing about that particular study is that it did show some level of cognitive changes. Whether or not that's going to be something that leads to depression or cognitive function is unknown at this period of time. But the thing about that study is it's not as well published as the other studies that I just mentioned, because it didn't confirm any type of bias. It actually suggested that there are cognitive changes that happen when somebody is choked over time. So, or does repeated choking with sex. Again, it's a relatively small sample size. Further study is needed, and further study down the road is definitely needed. So if I were to personally design a study that was looking at the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu community, I would be looking at people in an age group of 65 plus who have their black belts that hopefully started in their 30s or before, so that and that are still practicing. Because what I would want to know is whether or not that demographic necessarily has a higher occurrence rate of signs of mental decline and or instances of dementia when contrasted with the general public. And if we are seeing, oh my God, there are a lot more people who are at that level who did practice for this amount of time, that would be assumed that would have significant instances of being choked over that time, we'd be able to determine, okay, this definitely had led to a increase of brain malfunction, sorry. ADHD eventually reached to that point where my mouth is dry and it's really hard for me to keep my thoughts going. But we would be able to determine how detrimental that was over time, whether or not there is a higher occurrence of brain diseases that occur in latter life, because that's really the question that was being posed, was does choking, particularly recreationally, lead to higher occurrences of dementia in your senior years? So again, that's a very important question to be answering or asking. And because we do not really have many studies that have actually been conducted, particularly when it comes to erotic asphyxia, that is a very difficult subject to get participants for, because there are social stigmas that make people feel like they can't come out and talk to people about this, right? They can't talk to their loved ones, they can't talk to their family, they can't talk to their doctor, they can't talk to their psychiatrist, their psychologist, or any support group, because they are afraid of the judgment that comes with it, because of the stigmas that keeps getting perpetuated. And so they're not going to volunteer for studies, and their doctor might not suggest, hey, there is a study that is coming out that is looking at these effects. I know that you participate in this type of activity. Hey, maybe you should get involved in this study. This might be something that you could actually do a lot of good, and also might help you get a better understanding of how this behavior is affecting you. And again, this is me saying that the fear of being critical of the information that's out there, the sources that it's coming from, and being critical of the studies and the lack thereof, and fighting these social stigmas is really, really, our attitudes as a society are really, really holding us back on knowing how to help people who are already engaging in this activity. The psychiatrist and psychological communities do not necessarily always know the best way of talking with people when they bring up that they are into erotic asphyxia. They really want to, get the person to stop, but sometimes when people come at people like that people, again, they just shut down and they're not willing to listen. So, and I have, at times, I finished jiu-jitsu and I had some symptoms that I thought might have been related to the fact that I had been choked. And when I brought it up to my doctor, he was very judgmental and didn't want to talk about it. So I do have lived experience to know that by not talking about it, by not being more open-minded about it as a society, we are closing down discussion and preventing care that might actually be life-saving for people who are engaging in this type of behavior. So where do we go from here? Right? Looking at it, I think we need to have more open discussions. I think that we need to collect more data. I think that we need to stop being so judgmental, because, again, it's just hurting our society by doing so. So again, I'm going to go ahead and go back to where I started in this. If you guys feel like I have missed some very important data, that I haven't addressed a study out there that really needs to be talked about here, that proves that I'm a jackass and that I'm wrong, you can very politely go into the comment section below and just say, hey, did you look at this study? And I will look at the study, I will read it. If you present your opinions in a way that furthers the discussion without being judgmental, I'm happy to hear it. If you are going to go into the comments and insult me, call me a Trumper, which I'm not, I'm very liberal, I talked against the idea of abstinence-only education, come on people, or anything along those lines, or if you think that the way that I talked about this was in any way, shape, or form permissive, first of all, I'm sorry that you feel that way, but at the same time, the discussions that I have had since posting the other videos have actually been generally respectful when it comes to the people who are participating in erotic asphyxia, and some people have voiced that they're struggling with addiction. Some people have voiced the concerns that they're not sure if they keep pushing it too far. And by talking about it in this way, I've communicated to them that I am somebody who is safe, and I am not going to take this video down or humor the idea that I'm in any way, shape, or form being permissive by being non-judgmental. I think that's the wrong attitude, and I think that it actually is going to do more damage in the long run than just putting out the facts in an unbiased way, being critical of the data that we actually exist, and letting people come to their own conclusions, because at the end of the day, I can't control what you do. I can't control what anybody else does. I don't have my hands on the joysticks. I don't have the don't choke yourself button that I can just push and then suddenly people are going to stop doing it. Instead, I am meeting people on their level as somebody that has been choked, who has enjoyed being choked. I have practiced erotic asphyxia, and I probably still will from time to time. And that is going with me knowing all of the risks that are associated with it. I'm not giving people permission to do it because I'm doing it. It's just that I think that there needs to be a lot more nuance. I think people need to be aware that what they're seeing in porn is not representative of the actual realities of somebody being choked out. That pushing it further and further and further, doing repeat chokeouts, things like that, is just increasing your risk exponentially. And I believe that talking to people like they're adults, capable of making their own decisions, and looking at the data in an objective way, and telling people to be critical of anecdotal information or poorly designed studies does more good than it does harm, right? Because when you do a Google search, if you actually try to do a Google search trying to find good quality non-judgmental information on the internet, or not information that's not extremely biased one way or the other, it's really hard. And a lot of the stuff that you're going to find is more permissive than anything that I've said in this video. It is making it sound a lot safer than it really is. And so you can hate me, I guess. I'll just delete your comments. I'm not going to humor bullying. I'm not going to humor threats. And if you don't think that this is something that is worthy of talking about, I mean, honestly, you can go fuck yourself. Because at the end of the day, people need to be informed, people need to be respected, and people need to be met with empathy, understanding of where they're coming from, and treated like adults. Because that is the only way that you can convince somebody that maybe they need to alter their behavior, right? But when it comes to behavior alteration, the decision really has to come from the other person. It really has to come from the person who is engaging in erotic asphyxia. So if they're looking at that and saying, okay, it's not worth the risk, I'm just not going to do it, great. If they're starting to see symptoms where they're more depressed all the time, that could be because you're getting choked. You might have focus issues. That could be because you're getting choked. You might have more anxiety. Your body's having problems processing the environment around you. That could be coming from being choked. So that is something that you need to be talking to your providers about in case they're like, oh, well, let's go ahead and examine. Well, maybe your blood flow to your brain's getting restricted in some way that we haven't recognized. Maybe that's something that we need to address. Oh my God, it looks like you're about to have a stroke. We need to address that right now. So not talking about it is just preventing people from getting the help that they need. So thank you for watching. I hope that the way that I've done it today leads people to be more respectful in the future and more open-minded to having these conversations, because when we shut them down, it does nobody any good. When we shout at people and say, just don't do it, and we catastrophize, people stop listening. And that does no one any good. So don't be a dick. Just, if you have a point, disagree with something I said, put it in the comments. Email me. I will be happy to look at that. I will be happy to give weigh in. I will be happy to make another video. I'll be happy to redo it if this whole thing is a clusterfuck that just really misses the mark. You know, lay out your data. Don't expect me to take your word for it, because I won't, right? Because, you know, I have done a considerable amount of research to prepare for this. I do know what I'm talking about, and I do have life experience in this department that is absolutely relevant. And if you're saying leave it to doctors to say something, guess what? The doctors aren't saying anything. There's a vacuum, and we're relying on Google and news outlets overblowing bad studies to educate people. And that is incredibly dangerous. So I'm not saying don't do your own research. Don't use Google. I'm saying that you need to be critical of the results that you're finding, because Google is not auditing your results. And the amount of bias that is very much so geared towards chokes are safer than previously believed is staggering. And it is first page search. So thank you. You guys have a good one. Please try to be respectful, and we'll see you on the next one.